Hi, my name is Chris and this is Battle Nonsense. Soon Battlefield 1 will get quite a big netcode update in the CTE, which means that now is a good time to finally test the retail version of Battlefield 1 so that we get some reference data that we can then compare the changes in the CTE to. But before we get into the specifics of this title, we must have a look at a few networking basics which you need to know in order to understand the results of my tests. The reason why I include this basic information in every video is that since I keep testing new games, I must also consider that these attract new people who have never seen such a netcode analysis before, and so they might not know what I mean when I talk about tick rates, update rates and all the other things. So in the past I have tried to tell my audience to please go and watch that other video first which provided that basic information, but that just didn't work. And so I got a lot of people who were either confused by my test results or just misinterpreted them. So I know that this is annoying for those of you who have seen my previous videos, but this issue with confusing people is gone since I started to include the basic section in every video. So while I can provide a cut to the chase version for my patrons, I have to continue to include the basic section here on YouTube, as this is the place which attracts new viewers. However, I will always provide at least one timecode link in the description and one in a pinned comment, so that you can skip the basic section if you want to. I cannot add an annotation as Google pulled the plug on them. What would be great to have is a chapter feature that also works on mobile. I have created a little design concept for such a feature, so if you would like to support that concept, then you can find a link to the Reddit topic in the description down below. So let's start with the ping. What is that and where does the term come from? If you have seen the movie The Hunt for Red October, then you might remember that scene where Sean Connery gave the order to check the distance to the US submarine with one active sonar ping. The way this works is that your ship sends out an audio signal, which then gets reflected by other objects in the water. And on your ship you have microphones or hydrophones which hear that reflection. You can then determine the distance between you and that object by measuring the time between sending the audio signal and receiving the reflection. The ping that we talk about for network connections between different devices is pretty much the same thing. Your device sends an ICMP echo request to another network device, like a game server, which then sends an ICMP echo reply back to your device. Now, when we measure the time between sending the request and receiving the answer, then this gives us the ping or round-trip time of the data. So the ping tells us how long the data has to travel through the copper and fiber optic cables to reach the other device. And the longer it takes the data to get to its destination, the bigger the difference between what we see on our monitor and what the other players see on theirs, which is what we call lag. So when I jump, then it takes this information some time to reach the server and the other client. With short distances and good routing between the players and the server, this delay or lag is also very low. However, the bigger the distance between the clients, the longer it will take until they receive an update on what is happening. So the higher your ping, the more you will lag, which means that you have a bad experience. But it's not just the player with the high ping that suffers. Depending on how strong the lag compensation is in a game, the high ping player can also give the low ping player a bad experience, as the low ping player then either receives damage very far behind cover or gets shot by the high ping player before he can even see him. However, you cannot determine your ping by drawing a straight line on a map between your home and the location where the server is hosted, because the copper and fiber optic cables take a very different route. And the data that you send to the server has to pass through multiple routers before it reaches the server. So when a router has to forward data, then it usually tries to choose the best route. This means that when everything works as it should, then your data will take the shortest route to the game server. But it can happen that a router either chooses a bad route, or that it has to choose a worse one when the better one is down, or that it is configured to choose the cheapest route. Such can then lead to quite big detours for your data, which can also result in much higher pings and an increased risk of packet loss, since your data might have to pass through many more routers then. So when you always play on the same server and suddenly notice that you have a much higher ping than usual, then this could be caused by routing. And in such cases you will have to call your internet service provider so that they can check their routing tables. And if you want to help them to get the issue fixed faster, then you can provide them with trace or route data for that server. For that you open the command prompt, type in tracert and the IP of the game server that you have problems with. You will then get a list of all the hops between you and the game server with the pings between you and each of these hops. However, please be aware that depending on its configuration, a hop might not reply to your ICMP echo request at all or with a delay. And the same is true for game servers where many do not reply when you try to ping them from the command prompt. So the length of the route that connects the client to the server and the amount of hops between them defines how long it takes data to travel between them. So the lag that we experience in a game can never be lower than the data travel time, because for that we would have to break the laws of physics to speed up the electrons or photons that are used to communicate with the server. What adds an additional delay on top of the travel time of our data is how frequently we send and receive it. So when we send and receive 30 updates per second, then there is more time between the updates than when we send and receive 60 updates per second. So by sending and receiving more updates per second, you can decrease the additional delay that is added on top of the travel time of your data. But where is that data coming from? This is where the term tick or simulation rate comes into play, which is how many times per second the game processes and produces data. So when we have a tick or simulation rate of 30, then this will cause more delay than when you use a tick rate of 60, which also allows update rates of 60 Hz then. But it's not only important how many simulations are done per second, it's also critical that the server finishes a tick as fast as possible, because at a tick rate of 60 Hz, it only has a processing window of 16.66 milliseconds for every simulation step. So at the beginning of a tick, the server starts to process the data it received and it runs its simulations. Once that is done, it sends the results to the clients and then sleeps until the next tick happens. The faster the server finishes a tick, the earlier the clients will receive new data from the server, which reduces the delays between players and makes the hit registration feel more responsive. This is something that I showed in my previous Battlefield 4 tests, where the NetGraph displays the time the server needs to finish a tick. So when it comes to the server's performance, then it's imperative that it finishes a simulation step as fast as possible, or at least inside the processing window that is given by the tick rate. When it gets close to that limit or even fails to process a tick inside of the time frame, then you will instantly notice this, as that results in all sorts of strange gameplay issues like rubber banding, players teleporting, hits getting rejected, physics failing, etc. Now, what options do developers have when it comes to providing servers? One solution is that you pay hosters to set up dedicated servers for your games in their data centers, to which the players then connect to. This means that your game server is running on powerful hardware and the data center has enough bandwidth to handle all those players that connect to it. Also, when the matchmaking makes sure that all players have more or less the same ping to the game server, then you can avoid that players have an unfair advantage or give other players a bad experience. One of the downsides is that if you don't have a game that builds around the idea of the community running these servers, then the publisher or game studio has to pay for them, and they are quite expensive. Another problem is that when you release your game worldwide, then you also need to make sure that you have enough server locations to provide all of your players with low latency servers. If you don't do that, then you create many high ping players, and that is a problem for your entire community, not just for the players who don't have servers near them. A different approach, which many people falsely refer to as peer-to-peer, is that you simply use the PC or console of a player to host the game, which means that he becomes the server. With this solution, the game studio does not have to pay for expensive, dedicated game servers, which must also be available in many different regions. This also allows players located in remote regions to play with their friends at relatively low latency. The downside is that the player who is also the server gets an advantage, because he has zero lag, which means that he will see you before you see him, and he can fire at you before you can fire at him. Then we also have the problem that all players connect to the host through his consumer-grade internet connection, when the worst case he could even use Wi-Fi locally. This frequently results in a lot of lag, packet loss, rubber banding, and an unreliable hit registration. But the most frustrating part of such client-hosted matches is that when your host disappears, then the game must choose another player to host the match, which means that the whole game pauses for several seconds until the host migration has finished. And if this wouldn't be enough, there is also the problem that the host can see the IP addresses of all players that connect to him, and anti-cheat is also always a big concern when you trust the client to handle the entire hit registration and simulation. Then we got the peer-to-peer network model, which you usually see in 1v1 fighting games. But a recent game that is using this model in game modes with more than 2 players is For Honor. So in this network model we do not have a dedicated server, nor is a client elected to host the match and run the simulation. However, one player is elected to be the session host, which then takes care of invites and handshakes. In For Honor, every client runs its own synchronized simulation and sends its data to every other client. This means that every client is also partially a game server. The pros of this setup are that the publisher or studio does not have to pay for expensive game servers that must be hosted in many different regions. Players in remote regions can play with their friends at relatively low pings, and this model should not suffer from the host advantage issue that client-hosted games have. However, there are quite a few videos out there which show that lag switching is still working to some degree. One downside of this network model is that the game will pause for several seconds when the session host leaves, as another client must then take over his function. That said, while this is very disruptive, it does not take as long as when the game host disappears in a client-hosted match. Another downside is that because every client runs its own simulation, the responsiveness of the hit registration will probably also vary depending on the ping of the player you engage. So when you fight a player to which you have a ping of 5 milliseconds, then the hit registration might feel better than when you engage a player to which you have a ping of 148 milliseconds. Or players who have a high ping make the hit registration less responsive in general, as the clients keep the simulation in sync. Probably the biggest downside of this model is security, as every game client knows and sees the WAN IP addresses of the other players. Besides that, there are a few other concerns that this peer-to-peer model has in common with client-hosted matches, like the impact of underpowered hardware used by the players as well as the players' consumer-grade internet connection, as all clients talk to each other to keep their simulation in sync. And anti-cheat is also always a big concern in games that do not have an authoritative game server. So, even though dedicated servers do not magically provide 100% lag-free connections, I believe that they offer the best possible experience in online multiplayer games where you have more than 2 players participate in a match. So just like all the previous Battlefield titles, Battlefield 1 uses dedicated servers which are available in these areas. However, as far as I know, the Middle East servers at least had some initial issues which resulted in unusually high pings. That was caused by the routing of the local internet service providers. I'm not sure if that has been resolved by now, but a few weeks ago that problem still existed. Also, players can rent their own Battlefield 1 server. However, with Battlefield 1, EA and DICE kicked out all third-party hosters from which you could rent game servers for the previous titles. Now you can only rent servers from EA directly from inside the game. Sadly, this did not only result in fewer options for the hosting locations, as you can just select the region where you want your Battlefield 1 server to be hosted, while in the previous titles you could choose from multiple locations inside the region. You also have much less control over the server now, as Battlefield 1 does not support Archon and tools like Procon, which means that the server administration is now only possible directly inside the game. The administration options of a Battlefield 1 server are still very basic, as you can't even set a password for your own server. If you want to know more about the Battlefield 1 Rent a Server program, then you can find a link to a video in the description down below. Now, what tick rate does Battlefield 1 use? On the PC the game runs at a default tick rate of 60 Hz, while on console it's sadly just 30 Hz. You can find the active tick rate here inside the server browser. Or you can enable the NetGraph, which will then show you the active tick rate here.
We have lost objective Charlie.
Now, how about the update rates? This topic is actually quite complex because you need to get creative to keep the bandwidth requirements low in a game that supports 64 players and runs at 60 Hz. Thankfully, one of the developers was so kind to explain to me what they changed in Battlefield 1, and he also allowed me to share this information with you guys. So, the easy part first. A client sends updates at the same rate as the tick rate. So, when you play on a 60 Hz server, then you send 60 updates per second. However, damage data is not sent at a fixed rate, because when you deal damage to another player, then this data is sent at the same rate as your frame rate. This means that when you play at 120 FPS on a 60 Hz server, then the damage data is sent at 120 Hz and not at 60 Hz, which slightly decreases the delay for sending damage data. That said, this also means that when you play at 45 FPS on a 60Hz server, then your damage data is also sent at 45 Hz and not at 60 Hz, which I guess is part of the reason why you see the low FPS warning when your frame rate goes below the tick rate. So that is the update rate for data that the client sends to the server. Where it gets really interesting is when we look at the data that we receive from the server. So if the server would constantly send you data at 60 Hz about everything that is happening on a full 64-player server, then this would simply be too much data. So the developers came up with a feature that will limit how frequently you receive data depending on where the other players are. Now this little dot here represents you, the infantry player. Around you there's a high frequency update area with a radius of 30 meters. So for everything that is happening inside of that area, your client will receive updates from the server at the maximum rate. This means that when you play on a 60 Hz server, then you receive 60 updates per second for what is happening inside that area. In addition to that, we have a second area, which is based on your field of view. So up to 30 meters away you receive everything at the highest rate because that is the radius of the high frequency update area around the player. For 30 to 80 meters the update rate goes then down to 10 Hz, and from 80 meters to 200 meters the rate then further decreases down to 3 Hz. So depending on where something is happening, the server will send you that information at a different rate. The exception is again damage, because no matter where the enemy player is, the server will send you his damage information at the highest possible rate. So even when the shooter is outside the high frequency update area, you will still receive a hit at the same rate as the tick rate and not at a lower rate. So these are the high frequency update areas for infantry players. When you get into a vehicle, then these areas are very similar. However, the area around your vehicle then has a radius of 40 meters instead of 30 meters. So as I said, the maximum rate at which you receive data is the same as the tick rate, which is why the receive rate value in the NetGraph will usually be the same as the tick rate. However, when your connection is for some reason unable to handle the amount of data you receive from the server, then the system is able to reduce your maximum receive rate, as you can see here in this example where I artificially limited the bandwidth of my internet connection. So as long as your internet connection is able to handle the amount of data you receive from the server will send you updates at the maximum rate, which is the same as the tick rate. Now, besides update rates and the tick rate, the time that the server needs to finish a tick also has a very big impact on how good or bad the hit registration feels. To find out how long the server needs to finish a tick, we just have to take a look at the server tick value inside the NetGraph, where lower values are always better. This value is affected by the amount of players that are on the server, which map is active as some are more demanding than others, and it will increase slightly as the match progresses. At a tick rate of 60 Hz, the maximum for this value is 16.66 milliseconds, because that is the time frame between two ticks at 60 Hz. However, you can feel a difference in the hit registration once this value goes beyond 12 milliseconds. And on console, where Battlefield 1 is sadly running at just 30 Hz, the maximum value for the server tick is 33.33 milliseconds. However, you will notice that the hit registration starts to feel worse past 15 milliseconds. Another important factor is your ping to the game server. In Battlefield games you can see your ping to the game server inside the server browser and inside the scoreboard, where you also see the ping of every single player who is on the same server. One odd thing that I noticed in the server browser is that it shows me a ping of 44 milliseconds to a server to which I actually have a ping of just 25 milliseconds. I'm not sure why this is happening, but this is something that I have not seen in any of the previous Battlefield games. So it seems like you can't quite trust the ping that you see in the server browser, while the value displayed in the scoreboard is accurate. In addition to the ping that we see in the scoreboard, we also have a latency value here inside the NetGraph, which unlike the ping in the scoreboard is not based on an ICMP echo request, but the actual game data that is sent and received by the client. So it's normal that this value here is not the same as the ping in the scoreboard. So, as you know, it's not only important that your latency is as low as possible, it must also be stable. So when your latency goes up and down wildly, then this latency variation will result in a bad experience, as the game then constantly has to adjust to your changing latency. How much variation your network connection has is displayed here as network variation. What is also critical is that data doesn't get lost between the server and your client, which is why you should keep an eye on the packet loss value, which is the sum of both the incoming and outgoing packet loss. But you don't need to have the network graph open all the time. The game will show you warning icons when your latency gets too high, or when you have too much latency variation, or when you have packet loss. These warning icons use a color code, where yellow means that the issue is minor and you might see some small issues in-game, while red means that the issue is severe and your experience will suffer as a result. Now, what kind of effect does all of this have on the delay that two players experience when they play on the same server? To test this, I use a high-speed camera, two PCs where each of them has its own fiber internet connection, and 144Hz gaming monitors on which the game runs at more than 144 FPS, with all graphic options set to the lowest value. To measure the delays between the players, I point my high-speed camera at the monitors, and then have player 2 shoot 20 times at player 1. Inside the high-speed recording, I then look for the frame where I see that player 2 started to fire, and then I count the frames until I see that the damage was received by player 1, which is indicated by either blood splatter, a damage indicator, or the update of the health indicator depending on what happens first and what is available in the game. In addition to this damage delay test, I also check the delay of the gunfire animation, as well as the movement delay. So with a ping of 25 milliseconds for both players, I measured an average damage delay of 75 milliseconds, an average gunfire delay of 63 milliseconds, and an average movement delay of 76.5 milliseconds. What is strange about these values here is that there is a very low difference between the minimum and the maximum values. So I thought that maybe this is somehow caused by DirectX 12, so I disabled that, but the results were the same. Then I repeated the tests on two other servers where I also got the same results. So then I decided to test Overwatch again to make sure that there wasn't something strange going on with my setup. But since that test produced values similar to my last test, I can be fairly sure that my system is okay. I have already sent that information to the developer who is working on the netcode, and once the CTE gets all the netcode changes, we will then see what effect this has on the delays and if they are still higher than what I measured back in the beta and in Battlefield 4. Now, one of the most infuriating gameplay experiences in online shooters is when you receive damage very far behind cover despite playing at a very low ping. But why does this happen and what can be done to mitigate or prevent the issue? So we know that when a player has a high ping, then his data needs a long time to travel between the client and the game server. This means that a player who has a low ping might already see himself behind cover, while the player with the high ping can still see him. The reason why the high ping player can still hit him is that the game uses lag compensation. If you now think that we just have to remove lag compensation and then everything is fine, then you are wrong, because that would make a game unplayable even at low pings of just 50 milliseconds. What we really need is that more games finally use sane limits for how much lag they compensate. Now, I do not want to suggest that the values used in Battlefield 4 are the best, but in this game the lag compensation causes that the player will get his hit confirmed by the server as long as he has a ping of less than 250 milliseconds. Once his ping is higher than that, the server will simply reject his hit in this situation, which means that the high ping player sees the impact animation and the blood splatter, but he will not get a hit marker as his shot will not deal any damage. This is what many players refer to as dusting. So why does the server reject the hit in this situation once the shooter has a ping of more than 250 milliseconds? As we all know, the time that data needs to travel between the player and the server causes that the perspective of the server differs from the perspective of the player. How much it differs depends on how long the data needs to travel between them or how high the player's ping is. So when the shooter has a ping of 250 milliseconds, then he sees our low ping player here, while the server sees him here, and the low ping player sees himself here. The server will stop to register a hit once the difference between where the server sees the target player and where the shooter sees him gets too big, which happens when the ping of the shooter increases to more than 250 milliseconds in this example, or when the target moves faster, which is why Battlefield games use two different lag compensation or frame history time values, one for infantry combat and one for vehicle combat. If you would use the infantry combat lag compensation or frame history time value for vehicle combat too, then you would get constant dusting in dogfights because jets are a lot faster than infantry players. A few of you might remember that there even was a bug in Battlefield 4 which caused that exact issue. Now how about Battlefield 1? When I do the exact same test as in Battlefield 4, then the server will not stop to register the hit once the shooter has more than 250 milliseconds ping. It will confirm the hit until the shooter's ping is higher than 475 milliseconds, which makes the issue of receiving damage behind cover much worse than it is in Battlefield 4. Now, while this is very frustrating, the upcoming netcode changes that will hit the CTE soon might provide a solution that works better than what we have in Battlefield 4. And as soon as these changes become available, I will test them and then show you how they work and if they actually help. So, I hope that you enjoyed this in-depth netcode analysis of Battlefield 1, and if you like this kind of niche content where I take a look at the inner workings of video games and show you how these affect your experience, then you can help me to cover the costs of this channel by supporting me through Patreon. The link is in the description below. Also, if you want to know what I'm currently working on, then you can follow me on Twitter or Facebook. The links are also in the description of this video. If you enjoyed this video, then please give it a like, subscribe for more, and I hope to see you next time. Until then, have a nice day and take care. My name is Chris and this was Battle Nonsense.